The day Lenora Chandler walked into her fifth bank in 3 weeks, she already knew what the answer would be. But she squared her shoulders anyway and walked through that door like a woman who still believed the world owed her a fair hearing. The summer of 1878 had settled over Crestfall, Texas, with the particular cruelty of a season that doesn't care what you've been through. The dust came off the main street in soft brown waves whenever a wagon rolled past, and the heat pressed down on everything like a flat iron, leaving the whole town wrinkled and exhausted by noon. Lenora had been up since 4 in the morning, the way she always was since Thomas died, because sleep had become a luxury that grief didn't much allow. She'd fed her 2 children breakfast, made sure her 8-year-old son, Cody, had his shirt tucked in proper, kissed her 5-year-old daughter, Alma, on the top of her warm head, and then asked old Mrs. Prout from 2 lots over to watch them for the morning while she made the drive into town. She'd worn her best dress, which wasn't saying much. It was dark green with small white buttons down the front, and a collar she'd pressed twice the night before. Thomas had always said she looked like spring in that dress, and she hadn't been able to bring herself to get rid of it even though wearing it without him made the air feel thinner somehow. She'd pinned her dark hair up under her good hat and driven the wagon herself the 4 miles into Crestfall, sitting straight as a fence post all the way there. The Crestfall Savings and Lending Institution was the biggest of the 5 banks she'd visited, housed in a 2-story limestone building, with the bank's name carved right into the stone above the door like it was announcing itself to God. Inside, it smelled of linseed oil and old paper, and a ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, doing very little good for anyone. The man behind the main desk was named Preston Aldridge. He had side whiskers the color of old corn husks, and the kind of practiced, polite expression that people develop when they spend their lives saying no to people they feel superior to. He was maybe 50 years old and wore a gold watch chain across his vest that caught the light every time he moved, which seemed deliberate. "Mrs. Chandler," he said, folding his hands on the desk after he'd heard her out. "I appreciate your situation, truly I do. Losing a husband is a hard thing for a woman. But you have to understand, the bank cannot extend credit to a party that has no clear means of repayment. Your farm is mortgaged already. You have no male cosigner. You have no collateral of sufficient value." "I have 40 acres of the best bottomland in Harker County," Lenora said, keeping her voice even. "I have a barn full of tools and equipment. I have 2 draft horses and a milk cow. I have a standing contract with the grain cooperative that Thomas arranged before he passed." "That contract was in your husband's name," Preston said gently, as though gentleness made the words land softer. "I have been farming that land for 9 years," she said. "My name is on the deed alongside his. I know every inch of that soil. I know what it can produce." Preston Aldridge looked at her with genuine sympathy, which was somehow worse than contempt would have been, because sympathy didn't change a single thing. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chandler. The bank's policy is quite clear." She stood, picked up her reticule, thanked him for his time in a voice that didn't tremble, and walked back out into the blazing Texas sun. She stood on the limestone step for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the heat on her face, and let herself have exactly 3 seconds of despair before she put it away and thought about what came next. Thomas had been dead for 4 months. He'd gone out to check the fence line on the eastern edge of the property after a storm blew through in March, and his horse had come back alone 3 hours later. They'd found him where he'd fallen in the shallow draw near the creek, where the bank had given way in the wet ground. The doctor said it was quick. She supposed she was meant to find comfort in that. What she was left with was a farm that needed a new well, because the old one had started pulling up mud and iron water in the spring, and without a good well, you couldn't run a working farm in a Texas summer. The estimate she'd gotten from the well digger, a quiet German man named Heinrich Brunner who had a reputation for honest work, was $65. It might as well have been $600 for all the difference it made to her account at the local savings house, which held a sum barely sufficient to see them through August if she was careful. She'd gone first to the Harker County Agricultural Bank, which had loaned Thomas money twice before for equipment. They'd turned her down in 15 minutes. Then she tried the Cattlemen's Trust over on River Street, run by a man named Fowler who'd gone to church with Thomas and sat in the pew right behind theirs. Fowler had refused her with more words than the agricultural bank, but it amounted to the same thing. The private lending house run by two brothers named Garnett had turned her away in what she suspected was under 4 minutes. The small lending office attached to the General Mercantile had suggested, with uncomfortable delicacy, that she might consider remarrying. And now Preston Aldridge of the Crestfall Savings and Lending Institution had told her the bank's policy was quite clear. She climbed back onto the wagon seat and sat for a moment, looking at the main street of Crestfall. It was a decent-sized town, not large by any measure, but it had a proper hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a livery, the post office, a doctor's office, a barber shop, and more lending institutions than most towns its size because the cattle trade had brought money through here for 2 decades, and wherever money moved, men appeared to charge interest on it. She had been to every single lending institution in Crestfall and in Harker County proper, including a small loan operation run out of a back office in Millfield, 12 miles east. Every single one had turned her down. She picked up the reins and was about to click the horses into motion when she heard her name. Lenora Chandler. She turned. Standing on the boardwalk outside the hardware store was Dorothy Finch, who had been the schoolteacher in Crestfall for 20 years and knew everything about everybody in the county, as a natural consequence of having taught most of them their letters. "Dorothy," Lenora said. Dorothy Finch was a wiry woman in her late 40s with iron-gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that could make a grown man feel like he hadn't done his homework. She walked over to the wagon with purposeful steps and looked up at Lenora with her sharp gray eyes. "I heard about your trouble," Dorothy said. "Word gets around. I'm sorry those bankers treated you the way they did." "I appreciate that, Dorothy. I want to tell you something," Dorothy said, "and I want you to hear it with an open mind because I know you're proud, and pride is a good quality in the right measure but a dangerous one when you're drowning." Lenora looked at her steadily. "I'm listening. There's a man north of town, about 7 miles up the Callaway Road, past the creek bend where the old Hennessy place used to be. He's got a cattle operation up there, the Double C Ranch. His name is Elijah Collier." "I've heard the name," Lenora said. "Most people in Harker County had." The Collier family had been in this part of Texas for 30 years, one of the original ranching families from before the cattle trail days. She knew the reputation but not the man personally. "Elijah Collier is not a bank," Dorothy said. "He's not a lending institution. He's a rancher, plain and simple. But he is a man of means and, more importantly, a man of conscience, and he has helped people before when the banks wouldn't. He doesn't advertise it because he's not in the lending business, and he doesn't want every down-on-his-luck soul in the territory showing up on his doorstep. But I know him, and I know his character, and I think you should ride out and speak to him." Lenora looked down the main street of Crestfall for a moment, thinking. "What would I offer him?" she asked. "I have no more collateral than I had when the banks refused me." "You offer him the truth," Dorothy said simply. "Tell him exactly what you told those bankers. Elijah Collier is not Preston Aldridge. He's not going to look at a policy manual." There was something in Dorothy Finch's voice that told Lenora this wasn't idle advice. Dorothy wasn't a woman who offered words carelessly. "All right," Lenora said. "I'll ride out tomorrow morning." She drove home in the heat of the afternoon thinking about a man she'd never met and wondering what kind of person helped strangers when everyone else with resources had turned their backs. She couldn't quite picture it. In her experience, people with money protected it the way they'd protect anything else valuable, with locks and lawyers and careful arithmetic about risk. That evening, she sat with Cody and Alma at the supper table and listened to Cody tell her about the rabbit he'd seen near the old fence that afternoon, and watched Alma carefully arrange her peas in a line before eating them one by one, and felt the particular quiet of a house where a man used to sit at the head of the table. She had loved Thomas. She had loved him the way you love something that becomes so much a part of your life you forget where you end and it begins. And losing him had been like losing a room in herself, a room she kept reaching for only to find empty air. But she had 2 children and 40 acres and a future that required her full attention, and so she grieved him in the space between midnight and dawn, where no one could see, and during the day she kept moving forward. She rose before first light, fed the animals, left a cold breakfast and a set of instructions for Cody, who was old enough at 8 to be responsible for an hour's worth of morning chores, kissed both her sleeping children, and drove the wagon north up the Callaway Road as the sky turned from black to violet to pale gold. The Double C Ranch appeared to her gradually, the way important things often do, first as a line of fence posts along the road, then as a windmill catching the early light, then as a cluster of buildings that resolved themselves into something substantial and well-kept as she drew closer. There was a large main house built of timber and stone, solid and square, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. Behind it spread a barn that was freshly painted red, several outbuildings, corrals with good horses moving in the morning cool, and beyond all of that, the open range stretching north as far as she could see with cattle grazing in the early gold light like dark punctuation marks on a vast cream page. It was, she noticed, a prosperous operation. Not flashy, not wasteful, but serious and functional and well-maintained. The kind of place built by someone who actually worked it and cared about what happened to it. A man came out of the barn as she turned her wagon through the gate. He stopped when he saw her, one hand still holding the barn door, and looked at her with an expression of mild and uncomplicated surprise. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a week's worth of beard that somehow looked intentional rather than neglected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who don't think about it because they've worked that way their whole lives, and he wore a plain blue work shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen real use. His eyes, as she drew the wagon to a stop and he walked toward her, were a dark brown that caught the morning light and held it. "Morning," he said, looking up at her with that steady, open gaze. "You've come a long way out for this early hour. Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Elijah Collier," she said. "You found him," he said. He reached up and tilted the brim of his hat in a gesture that was unconscious and easy. "And you are Lenora Chandler. My farm is on the south end of the county off Birch Creek Road. I've been sent to speak with you by Dorothy Finch." Something shifted in his expression, not closed but thoughtful. "Dorothy sent you." "She did." He looked at her for a moment and she looked back at him because she was not a woman who looked away first. Then he said, "Come down off that wagon, Mrs. Chandler. I'll put on some coffee and you can tell me what you need." The kitchen of the main house was clean and plain, the kind of kitchen a man keeps when he's been alone for a while and has made peace with his own company. There was a good iron stove, a pine table, 4 chairs, a shelf of simple cookware, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where the morning light was doing something extraordinary with the dew on the grass, turning it to a field of small fires. Elijah Collier made coffee with the efficient movements of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and set a cup in front of her without ceremony, and poured his own and sat down across from her and said, "Tell me." So she told him. She told it straight through, without embellishment and without self-pity, because she had used all her self-pity up on the road home from Crestfall the day before, and she had no more to spend. She told him about the well, about Thomas dying in the draw, about the 4 months since, about the farm and the contract with the cooperative and the bottomland and what she could produce from it. She told him about all 5 banks and what each of them had said, and she was specific about the amounts and the reasoning and the collateral she'd offered. She told him she needed $65 for Heinrich Brunner to dig the new well, and that without a well, she could not run the farm through summer and fall, And without the farm, she and her 2 children had nowhere to go. He listened to all of it without interrupting, with his coffee cup between his hands and his eyes on her face, and he had the quality that she would come to think of as his most essential one, the quality of genuine attention, of actually hearing what a person said as opposed to waiting for a pause in which to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Those banks refused you because you have no male cosigner," he said. It was not a question. "That is the stated reason, yes," she said. "That in policy," he said, with a small inflection that told her he found the policy in question somewhat contemptible. "Yes." He drank his coffee. Outside she could hear the ranch coming awake, the sound of horses in the corral, a distant voice calling something she couldn't make out, the clank of a gate. "I'm not a bank," Elijah said. "You understand that. I'm not set up to collect on a loan through any legal mechanism if things went wrong." "Dorothy told me you weren't a lender," Lenora said. "I'm not asking you to be one. I'm asking you to consider helping me, and I'm offering to pay you back with interest as soon as the harvest comes in. I know what that land can produce, Mr. Collier. I've been farming it for 9 years. Thomas planted crops, but I kept the books and I planted alongside him, and I have watched that soil for 9 growing seasons. I know what I'm asking for, and I know what I can return." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the way he looked at her that was not unkind, not calculating, just careful, the way a person looks at something they want to understand correctly. "I'll tell you what I'd want," he said at last. "Not interest. I don't need money, Mrs. Chandler, and charging interest on $65 from a widow with 2 children and good bottomland strikes me as an ugly thing to do." He paused. "What I want is for you to pay me back when you're able, at whatever rate makes sense for your harvest. No deadline, no penalty. And I want to send 2 of my hands out to help dig that well alongside Brunner, because digging wells is hard work and Heinrich is getting older." She had been braced for conditions, for strings, for the kind of help that comes wrapped in obligation and subtle power. She had not been braced for this. "That's all," she said carefully. "That's all," he said. She looked at him across the pine table in the good morning light, with the steam rising from her coffee cup and the sound of the ranch moving through the open window, and she did not understand him yet, but she thought she might like to. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question and she knew it, but she asked it anyway. He considered it honestly. "My mother was widowed when I was 12 years old," he said. "My father died of fever. We had this land and we had cattle and we had no money, and no one in the county would extend us credit, because a woman couldn't hold land in her own name by the law at that time. We had a neighbor, Old Man Calloway, the one this road is named after, who gave my mother the money she needed to keep us going that winter. He said the same thing I'm saying to you. Pay me when you can." He paused. "We paid him. We kept the ranch. My mother ran it for 6 years before she married again, and she ran it better than most men would have." He set his coffee cup down. "So that's why." Lenora sat with that for a moment. "I'll pay you back," she said. "You have my word." "I know you will," he said simply, as if this were obvious. "When do you need the funds?" She paid Heinrich Brunner his deposit that very afternoon and rode home with the remaining portion in her saddlebag, feeling something she had almost forgotten the texture of, which was relief. Not happiness, not yet, because happiness was a more complicated calculation, but the particular lightness of a weight that has been lifted, even a little, even temporarily. Heinrich Brunner brought his equipment out 5 days later, and Elijah Collier sent 2 of his ranch hands, a young Mexican man named Carlos and a quiet fellow from Georgia everyone called Birch, to help with the labor. The 4 of them, Heinrich and his 1 assistant and Carlos and Birch, dug the new well in 2 days of hard work, lining it with stone and fitting it with a good pump mechanism that would last 20 years if the children were careful with it. Elijah Collier came himself on the 2nd day, appearing in the mid-morning with a pack-horse carrying timber planks, and saying he'd had some extra lumber from a project on the North Range, and thought she might want a proper well housing around the new pump to keep debris out. Lenora was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, weeding between the squash rows, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes to look at him in the bright light. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said, already unloading the planks. She watched him work alongside his men for the rest of that morning, and she noticed that he didn't stand apart and supervise the way a man of his means might have. He picked up a hammer and built the well housing alongside Carlos and Birch, measuring and fitting the lumber with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. He had a quietness about him that was not unfriendly but was self-contained, the quietness of a man comfortable in his own company who had perhaps been in it too long. She brought out a midday meal of biscuits and salt pork, and a pot of beans she'd cooked that morning, and they all sat in the shade of the old oak tree at the edge of the yard to eat. Cody, who had been watching the well-digging operation with the intense, proprietary interest of an 8-year-old boy, attached himself to Carlos, who showed him how to tie a proper knot with a length of rope and taught him what the knot was called in Spanish. Alma sat next to Lenora and watched Elijah Collier with the frank, unself-conscious stare of a 5-year-old, and after a while she said, "You have a hat." Elijah looked at her with the same straightforward attention he gave everything. "I do," he agreed. "It's a big hat," Alma said. "It keeps the sun off," he said. Alma considered this. "My papa had a hat," she said. "He doesn't need it anymore." There was a small silence around the group, the kind that forms when something both sad and completely honest has been said by a child who doesn't yet know that adults prefer their sadnesses cushioned. "I'm sorry about your papa," Elijah said quietly. He said it to Alma directly, not to Lenora, not over the child's head but to her, which Lenora noticed. Alma nodded gravely. "Mama says he's in heaven watching us," she said. "That sounds right to me," Elijah said. After the meal, when the men had gone back to work and Alma had gone inside for her afternoon rest, Lenora sat on the porch steps for a moment, looking out at the yard where the new well housing was taking shape, and felt something she couldn't quite name. It was not romance, not yet. It was more like recognition, the way you sometimes recognize a quality in someone before you have words for what you're recognizing. The well was completed by late afternoon, and the men loaded their tools and prepared to head back to the Double C. Elijah shook hands with Heinrich Brunner, exchanged a few words with Carlos and Birch about the next morning's work on the ranch, and then came to where Lenora stood on the porch. "It'll serve you well," he said, nodding toward the new pump. "That's a good aquifer down there. Heinrich knows what he's doing." "Thank you," she said. "For the lumber, too, you didn't have to come yourself." He shrugged slightly, the way men do when they're not entirely comfortable receiving thanks. "I was in the area," he said, which was a lie they both understood as such, since his ranch was 7 miles up the road, but she let it pass because she understood the instinct behind it. He came back the following Sunday. He came, officially, to check that the pump was working correctly, which was a reason thin enough to see through but polite enough not to argue with. He brought a paper sack of lemon drops from the mercantile in Crestfall for the children, which Alma discovered immediately with great enthusiasm, and which Cody accepted with the studied nonchalance of a boy who wants very much to seem unimpressed and is failing. Lenora had just baked bread that morning, one of those mornings when baking felt like the only way to make the silence in the house manageable, and she offered him a slice with butter and they sat on the porch and talked. They talked for 3 hours. She hadn't talked for 3 hours straight since before Thomas died, maybe before that, because Thomas had been a quiet man and she'd learned to match his quietness, and she had forgotten that she had more words in her than she'd been using. They talked about the land, his and hers, about the different qualities of bottomland versus upland for different crops, about the wet spring and what it had done to everyone's planting schedule. They talked about the cattle trade and what the railhead in Abilene had meant for ranching operations in this part of Texas. She told him about growing up in Louisiana, in a small town outside Baton Rouge, on a farm that raised sugar cane, and how different Texas had seemed to her when she'd first come here with Thomas, how flat and enormous and full of sky. He told her about his grandfather coming to Texas from Tennessee with nothing but a horse and a land grant, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believed he could make something from nothing, and how that stubbornness had been handed down like a family name through the generations. He told her about his wife, Eleanor, who had died of diphtheria 6 years earlier, 2 years after they'd married. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without drama, but she could hear what was under the plainness. No children, she asked, because she was direct and always had been. No, he said. She was sick for a year before she died. We talked about children, but it never came to be. He looked out at the pasture. I've been alone out here since then, which is, at times, a large amount of alone. She understood that in the way you can only understand something you felt yourself. 6 years is a long time, she said. It is, he agreed. He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that was both careful and honest. I forget sometimes that there was a way to live that wasn't just the ranch and the work and the seasons coming around. It was a more intimate thing to say than he'd perhaps intended, and she could see him realize it as he said it. But she didn't look away, and neither did he. And for a moment the afternoon held them in that particular way that moments do when something is shifting. You should come to Sunday dinner, she said. 2 Sundays from now. I'll cook a proper meal, and you can stop using checking the pump as an excuse to make the ride. He looked at her with a startled expression that moved quickly into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Was I that obvious? You were perfectly obvious, she said. I didn't mind. He came to Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, and then the Sunday after that, and then it became the kind of thing that happens without anyone quite declaring it, that he would come on Sunday afternoons and sometimes on a Wednesday evening, and the children came to expect him, and then to look forward to him, and finally to simply accept him as a presence in the rhythm of their week, the way you accept things that feel right. Cody, who had been quiet and interior since his father's death, with the particular seriousness of a child who has taken on a grief too large for him, began to open up again in Elijah's company. Elijah treated him without condescension, as a person whose opinions were worth hearing and whose questions were worth answering fully. He brought Cody out to the Double C one Saturday and let the boy help with the horses, showing him how to brush a horse's coat properly and how to lead one in and out of a stall. And Cody came home that evening with straw in his hair and a look on his face that Lenora had not seen since before March. Alma simply adored him from the start, with the uncomplicated wholeness that small children bring to their attachments. She would climb into the chair next to him at the dinner table and tell him everything that had happened since his last visit in the same breathless, associative way she told stories, jumping from the rabbit near the fence to the cloud that looked like a horse to the fact that Cody had said a bad word when he hit his thumb with the small hammer, which Cody hotly denied. She's going to be formidable when she's grown, Elijah said one evening, watching Alma explain something at length to the cat, who endured it with the resigned dignity of a much put-upon animal. She already is, Lenora said. They were sitting on the porch in the warm September evening, and the summer was finally beginning to release its grip on the land, the air carrying the first whispers of fall. The harvest had been good. The new well had made an enormous difference, giving her reliable water through the dry months of August and the early September dry spell, and the bottomland had done what she'd promised Elijah it would do. She'd gotten a good price from the cooperative for her grain, and she had already set aside the $65 and the money she owed him. She brought it up directly, the way she did everything. I have your money, she said. All $65. I'd like to settle with you. He looked at her with a slight frown. There's no urgency, I said when you were able. I am able, she said, and I don't want it hanging over us. I want to be straight with you. He accepted that because he understood it. She went inside and came back with the money in an envelope and handed it to him, and he took it without ceremony. Thank you, he said, and then he said something that surprised her. I'm glad it went the way I thought it would. You were confident about that. I was confident about you, he said. He said it simply, just a statement of fact, but she felt it somewhere behind her sternum in a way that had nothing to do with logic. The fall came in gold and copper, and the sharp, clean smell of turned earth. And Elijah Collier kept coming on Sundays and Wednesdays, and sometimes they sat on the porch and talked for hours about everything and nothing. And sometimes he stayed for supper and helped Cody with his reading afterward while Lenora got Alma to bed. And sometimes when he left, she stood in the doorway and watched his horse move away down the road and felt a longing so specific and clear that it frightened her a little. Because she hadn't expected to feel it again. She hadn't planned for it. She'd been too busy surviving to plan for anything beyond the next season, the next payment, the next problem to solve. She had a farm to run, 2 children to raise, a future to build out of what remained of a life that had been partly dismantled. She had no room in her accounting for this, and yet there it was. She was honest with herself about it, the way she tried to be honest about everything. She was drawn to him. Not because he had helped her, though she respected that, but because of who he was when he sat across from her and listened, when he built something with his hands, when he spoke to her children as though their small concerns were worth his full regard. She was drawn to the quality of his attention and the straightforwardness of his character, and the particular sadness in him that matched the particular sadness in her without either of them making it into something dramatic. What she didn't know was whether any of this was something he felt, or whether she was simply the family he'd chosen to help and then grown fond of in a companionable, neighborly way. She found out in October. It was an evening in the second week of October, and he'd come on a Wednesday, and they'd had supper, and he'd helped the children with their work. And now the children were in bed, and they were sitting on the porch in the cooler air of the autumn night, the stars coming out thick and low the way they do in the Texas sky, with nothing between you and them for 100 miles. The lamp on the porch table threw a warm circle of light around them, and she could hear the wind in the live oaks along the fence line. She had been thinking about saying something, not sure what exactly, some kind of honest naming of what she thought was happening, because she didn't know any other way to operate. But before she could find the words, he said her name. Lenora. She looked at him. I need to say something, he said, and I'd rather say it directly than have it sitting in the room unspoken between us, because I've been leaving it unspoken for a while now and I'm tired of that. All right, she said. He turned slightly in his chair to face her more fully, and in the lamplight his eyes were very dark and very serious. I come here every Sunday and every Wednesday, he said. And I tell myself it's neighborly, that I'm being helpful, that it's the right thing to do for a widow with 2 children and a farm to run. He paused. But that's not all of it. Not even most of it, if I'm being honest. I come here because I want to. Because when I'm out at the ranch and it's quiet in the evening, this is where I want to be. With you and those 2 children who are going to run me ragged when they're older and on this porch in this particular light. He stopped. I'm not practiced at this. I haven't felt this since Elena, and it caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure, for a while, if it was something I should act on or something I should leave be. He met her eyes. I don't want to leave it be. The wind moved in the oaks, and somewhere in the dark a night bird called, and the lamp on the table held its quiet circle of light. Elijah, she said. I am 31 years old, and I have been a widow for 7 months, and I have 2 children and a farm, and I am not a simple proposition. I know that, he said, without hesitating. I loved my husband, she said. That doesn't go away because he's gone. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking it to. She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she'd learned to read the sky for weather, for what was true under what was visible. I feel it too, she said quietly. Whatever this is, I feel it too. He reached across the narrow space between their chairs and put his hand over hers where it rested on the armrest, and that was all, just his warm hand over hers in the lamplight, but it was enough. It was the beginning. He asked her to walk out with him properly, meaning, was she willing to have this acknowledged, to have it be a thing between them that people might see and know about? She said yes. He came to Sunday dinner the following week with wildflowers, which made Alma so delighted she actually applauded. and which made Cody look at his mother with an expression of complex calculation that resolved itself into cautious approval. The town of Crestfall noticed, because towns always do, and the opinions were varied. Dorothy Finch, who was privately quite pleased with herself for having set this in motion, said nothing but walked around the following several weeks with a particular expression of righteous satisfaction. The women of the Crestfall Ladies' Aid Society discussed it at their Tuesday meeting, and then continued discussing it at the Wednesday afternoon sewing circle, and then again on the following Sunday after church. And their opinions ranged from entirely favorable to mildly speculative, with the general consensus trending toward favorable, because Elijah Collier was well regarded, and Lenora Chandler was considered a woman of good character who had managed her difficulty with admirable dignity. Preston Aldridge at the Crestfall Savings and Lending Institution heard about it from his wife, who heard about it from the women's circle, and he had the decency to feel something adjacent to embarrassment when he thought about the conversation he'd had with Lenora Chandler across his desk that July morning. He didn't apologize, because men like Preston Aldridge didn't easily arrive at apologies, but he thought about it, and that was something. The autumn deepened, and so did what was growing between Lenora and Elijah, with the organic inevitability of things that are right for each other. They walked in the evenings along the fence line of her farm when the children were in bed, and Mrs. Pruitt had been enlisted to sit with them, walking in the cool fall air and the talking led to silences that were comfortable, and the comfortable silences led to closer proximity, and eventually, in the blue dusk of a November evening with the smell of wood smoke in the air and the land going still around them, he stopped walking and turned to her and said, "May I?" With his eyes on her face, and she said, "Yes," and he kissed her gently in the blue evening light, and it was the kind of kiss that is simultaneously a beginning and an answer. She hadn't known, quite, how much she'd missed being held by someone until he put his arms around her and she felt the solidity of it. She'd been carrying everything herself for 7 months, every decision, every fear, every worry about the farm and the children and the future, carrying it without anyone to set it down with at the end of the day. She didn't let herself fall apart now, because it wasn't in her nature, but she held on for a moment with her face against his chest and just breathed. He held her with the steadiness of someone who understood what was being asked of him. "You've been doing this alone a long time," he said quietly. "Long enough," she said. He asked her to marry him in December, in the kitchen of her farmhouse on a cold morning when the first hard frost had turned the yard white and the children were at school, and they were alone with their coffee at the kitchen table. He asked her without ceremony because ceremony wasn't either of their native languages, and he asked her directly. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to help you raise those 2 children, and I want to build something with you between both places, the farm and the ranch. I want to stop going home in the evenings and wanting to be here instead." He paused. "I know it's not a long time. 7 months isn't long, but I know what I know." She looked at him across the table in the winter morning light, her coffee warm between her hands. "What about the children?" she said, not as an objection but as a real question because they were the primary consideration. "I would be their stepfather," he said. "I'm not trying to replace Thomas. I wouldn't try. But I care about those children already, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure they knew it." She thought about Thomas and what Thomas would have wanted for his children and for her. Thomas had been a practical man who loved her without sentimentality, and she believed he would have wanted her to live and not merely to endure, would have wanted Cody and Alma to have stability and warmth and a full table. She didn't think he would have wanted her to say no to something good because the good had come from grief. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of complete, unguarded happiness, the kind of happiness that breaks across a private face when the person can't stop it. And she thought that she had not yet seen that expression on him, and that she was glad it was directed at her. They told the children that evening. Cody listened carefully and asked several specific questions about practical arrangements, which was very Cody, and then he asked Elijah whether, if they moved to the ranch, there would be room for his rabbit hutch. Elijah said there was an entire barn, and Cody said that seemed like enough room. Alma listened to all of this and then crawled into Elijah's lap and fell asleep there while the adults talked, which was a form of approval so complete it needed no translation. They married in the spring of 1879, on a Saturday in April when the wildflowers were out across the pastures in that extraordinary Texas way that makes you feel the world is briefly excessive with beauty. Dorothy Finch was there, looking righteous and satisfied, which was simply her natural expression made more so. Heinrich Brunner attended with his wife and shook Elijah's hand for a very long time. The men from the Double C, Carlos and Birch and the others, stood along the back of the small church in their best clothes with the patient good humor of men who are happy for their employer. Cody stood next to Elijah as a small, serious member of the wedding party, and Alma stood next to her mother and dropped half her flowers before they'd made it 10 feet, then scattered the rest of them in large, enthusiastic handfuls, which seemed to her entirely the right approach to the occasion. The ceremony was performed by the minister of the Crestfall Baptist Church, a man named Reverend Halloway who had known Elijah for 20 years and who blessed the union with the warmth of someone who has watched a lonely person come back to himself and is genuinely glad about it. When Elijah kissed her at the end of it, with the April light coming through the church windows and the congregation applauding and Alma clapping with specific determination, Lenora thought that the world could be genuinely surprising in its capacity for second chances. They consolidated the two properties in a way that made practical and logistical sense. The farmhouse on Birch Creek Road was leased to a young family new to the county who needed a good start, which gave Lenora an income from the property while keeping it in her possession. The farm itself continued to be worked under a cropping arrangement with the same cooperative Thomas had set up, overseen now jointly by Lenora and one of the Double C's experienced men who had farming background. They lived at the ranch, because the Double C was the larger operation, and because the main house was solid and spacious and had room for a family without crowding. Lenora put her mark on it gradually, the way women do, not by erasing what had been there but by adding to it. A new curtain here, a kitchen garden behind the house there, her grandmother's china on the shelf in the dining room, a rocking chair on the porch where she sat in the evenings with her mending while Elijah read or worked on the ranch accounts at the desk in the corner. The children settled into ranch life with the remarkable adaptability of children who have been loved enough to trust the future. Cody apprenticed himself to Carlos in matters of horsemanship, because Carlos was patient and skilled and didn't talk down to a boy who asked good questions. And by summer's end, Cody could handle a horse with competence that surprised visiting riders. Alma made the ranch dog her personal project, teaching him tricks with the same relentless conviction she brought to everything. And the dog, a large brown animal named Biscuit who had previously been distinguished mainly by his laziness, learned more commands in one summer than in the previous 3 years. Elijah was a stepfather in the truest sense, present and steady and consistent, not trying to be Thomas but being himself, which turned out to be exactly what those children needed. He was patient with Cody's quietness in the way that one interior person can be patient with another, and he matched Alma's extroversion with a gentle, amused engagement that delighted her. He helped Cody understand that grieving his father was allowed to take as long as it took, and that growing to care for a new person was not a betrayal. He told him this once plainly and directly on a morning when they were working with the horses together and Cody had been quiet in a particular way that spoke of something turning over inside him. "You know," Elijah said, not looking at the boy but at the horse he was brushing, "my father died when I was 12. People told me all kinds of things about how to feel about it. Most of them weren't particularly helpful." Cody looked at him. "What was helpful?" "Time," Elijah said. and being allowed to feel whatever I felt without having someone else's schedule about it. Cody was quiet for a moment. "I miss my dad," he said. "I know you do," Elijah said. "That's right and good, and it's going to be true for the rest of your life. Missing him doesn't have anything to do with what you feel about me or what I feel about you. There's room for both." Cody didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How do you get your horse to hold still when you're picking out the hooves?" And they moved on, the way people do, carrying both things. The summer of 1879 was good to the Double C. The cattle prices were strong. The rain came at the right times, and the land responded with the generosity it reserves for the years when everything lines up. Elijah had been planning to expand the herd for 2 years, and this was the year it made sense. And Lenora, who had a clear head for numbers and a farmer's instinctive understanding of risk and return, sat with him over the ranch accounts one evening and said, "I think you should wait one more season. Buy in the spring rather than now, when the fall sellers are driving prices up." He looked at the numbers and said, "You're right." In the same direct way he said everything, without wounded pride or reluctant concession, just acknowledgement. She liked that about him more than she could easily say, because she'd been told all her adult life by various men in various ways that her opinions about business and finance were charming but not quite within her domain. And Elijah simply treated her opinions as what they were, which was information worth considering. She became, over the months that followed, as integral to the running of the Double C as she had been to the running of the Chandler farm, which is to say very. She kept the books, which she was better at than Elijah, who was excellent at cattle and land and weather and mechanics, and who had no strong feelings about ledgers. She corresponded with the cooperative about the farm acreage. She negotiated a new arrangement with the grain merchant in Crestfall that got them better terms than Elijah had previously managed, partly because she was better at negotiation than Elijah, who was constitutionally honest in ways that limited his leverage, and partly because the merchant, a man named Galt, was genuinely surprised enough by her to agree to things he might otherwise have held firm on. Elijah found this last point somewhat amusing. "He agreed to those terms because he didn't expect you to ask," he said. "Most of them don't expect it," she said. "I've learned to use that." "Formidable," he said, which was what he said about Alma too, and which she'd taken as a compliment in both cases. Autumn came with its blue skies and gold light and the smell of wood smoke again, and with it came the news that Lenora was expecting. She told Elijah on a Sunday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, with the simple directness that was her way. He went very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it with a gentleness that was its own language. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I've done this twice before. I know how it goes." "You'll tell me if something is wrong," he said, which was a statement and a request and a kind of quiet declaration all at once. "I'll tell you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd seen on their wedding day, the one she'd come to know as his happiness unbothered by self-consciousness. "We'll need to make the east room into a nursery," he said. "In the spring," she agreed. "We have time." They told the children at supper that evening. Cody received the information with his characteristic gravity, and then asked a series of practical questions about logistics and sleeping arrangements, and whether the baby would share his room, which Lenora said it would not, and he nodded as though a concern had been addressed. Alma received the news with an ecstasy that was completely in proportion to her personality, standing up on her chair and announcing that she was going to teach the baby everything it needed to know, a pronouncement that the adults accepted with straight faces, and that the baby would, in due course, find very much to be true. The winter of 1879 was cold and long, and Lenora spent it tending to the household, and the books and her children and her growing belly with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, and Elijah spent it looking after her in ways that were practical and concrete, which was his mode of love. He stacked extra firewood. He made sure the house was warm. He drove the children to school himself on the cold mornings rather than have Lenora do it. He built a new set of shelves in the kitchen for her because she'd mentioned once that she needed more space for the preserves, and he built them one Saturday while she was at Dorothy Finch's house for a women's social, and she came home to find them already up and painted white. "You listened," she said, standing in the kitchen looking at the shelves. "I always listen," he said, which was true, and which she knew was true and which still moved her, because she'd spent enough time in the world to know that genuine attention is not a given. The baby was born in May of 1880, a boy, as healthy and vocal as anything Elijah had ever encountered, coming into the world on a warm spring morning with the windows open, and the sound of the ranch coming through them, and Dorothy Finch presiding over the business with the authority of a general. Lenora did what she'd done twice before, which was to work through it with gritted determination and emerge at the end of it exhausted and triumphant. Elijah, who had spent the hours of the birth outside on the porch with the concentrated anxiety of a man who cannot fix what is happening and finds this intolerable, came in when Dorothy called him and stood beside the bed looking at Lenora and at the small, indignant, red-faced person in her arms, and his face did the thing it sometimes did where everything he felt moved through it without his permission. "Hello," he said softly to the baby. The baby looked at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, which conveys somehow both complete incomprehension and profound attention. "He has your nose," Lenora said. "God help him," Elijah said, which made her laugh, which was exactly what he'd intended. They named him James Thomas Collier, James for Elijah's grandfather, the stubborn Tennessean who had ridden into Texas on a horse and a prayer. Thomas for the man who had loved Lenora and Cody and Alma first, and whom they would not forget. Lenora had suggested it, and Elijah had agreed without hesitation, because he understood without being told why it mattered. Cody, presented with his baby half-brother for the first time, looked at him with serious consideration and then looked at Elijah and said, "He's smaller than I expected." "He'll get bigger," Elijah said. "I expect I'll have to teach him things," Cody said. "I expect you will," Elijah agreed. Alma held the baby with the careful, fierce tenderness of someone who has been waiting her whole life for this specific responsibility, and whispered a long, detailed introduction to him that covered, as best anyone could tell, the names of all the animals on the ranch, the knots that Carlos had taught Cody, and the complete situation regarding the cloud that had looked like a horse back in the summer of 1878, which remained, in Alma's accounting, a significant event. James Thomas Collier grew into the particular chaos of a baby in a busy household, attended to by a mother who was organized and efficient, a father who was attentive and steady, and two older siblings who were deeply invested in his existence and occasionally too helpful. He was a good-natured baby, which was a mercy, because there was no shortage of handling. Life at the Double C in the years that followed had the quality of something that has found its form and settled into it, not static, because nothing in ranching or farming or the raising of children is ever static, but grounded, with a foundation that could absorb the inevitable difficulties without being overturned by them. There were difficulties. A fever moved through the county in the summer of 1881 and took 2 weeks of worry from them when James got sick and ran a high temperature, but he came through it under the care of the Crestfall doctor and Lenora's vigilant nursing. A poor grazing season the following year required Elijah to sell more of the herd than he'd wanted to, which meant recalculating their plans and tightening their budget, which Lenora managed with the unsentimental accuracy of someone who had once faced genuine hardship and knew the difference between an inconvenience and a crisis. A dispute with a neighboring rancher about a fence line required 3 long conversations and a surveyor's visit before it was resolved to everyone's partial satisfaction, which is the best that fence line disputes ever achieve. Through all of it, what remained constant was them. Not in the manner of a story where love resolves all difficulties, because they were both too practical for that version of things, but in the way of two people who have found in each other the person they can talk to honestly about the thing that is wrong, and who can trust that the conversation will lead somewhere useful. They argued sometimes because they were both strong-minded and both direct, and they didn't always agree. They argued about money and about the children, and once, memorably, about a horse Elijah wanted to buy that Lenora thought was overpriced for what it would produce, and she was right about the horse, and he knew she was right and said so, and they moved on. They argued about the management of the farm acreage, and about whether Cody was ready to take on more responsibility, and about how firm to be with Alma who, as she moved toward 9 and 10 and 11 years old, displayed an independence of mind and directness of expression that was clearly inherited from both sides and was simultaneously wonderful and exhausting. But their arguments had the quality of arguments between people who are not afraid of each other, who don't carry their disagreements as grievances or weapons, who say the difficult thing and then come back to the table. Lenora had not known before Elijah that it was possible to fight with someone and feel more secure in the relationship afterward rather than less, but she had learned it. The spring of 1883 brought news that altered the landscape of their lives. Cody, who was 13 now, had been corresponding with Thomas's brother, his uncle William Chandler, who lived in San Antonio and ran a law practice there. William had been kind since Thomas's death, sending letters every few months and small gifts at Christmas, maintaining a connection with his brother's family from a distance. He had written now to say that he would like Cody to consider, when he was old enough, studying law in San Antonio, that he would take the boy under his wing and see that he had the education Thomas would have wanted for him. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come along often, and Lenora and Elijah sat with it together over several evenings, turning it over carefully. Cody was too young now, but the offer would hold for a few years, and they wanted to make sure, when the time came, that Cody had the right information to make the decision himself. "It's what Thomas would have wanted," Lenora said one evening. "He always said Cody had a mind that needed more than a farm could give it." "That's not a slight to the farm," Elijah said. "No," she agreed. "Just a recognition that people are different and need different things." "We'll tell him," Elijah said, "and let him sit with it. He's old enough to have a view." Cody's view, delivered with the gravity of a 13-year-old who takes his views seriously, was that he wanted to wait and see, but that he appreciated knowing the opportunity was there. He shook Elijah's hand formally when they'd finished talking, which was such a Cody gesture, so earnest and so adult, that Lenora had to look at the window for a moment to compose herself. Summer came in that year with particular splendor, warm and wet in the right proportion, and the land responded with an abundance that felt almost like excess. The cattle grazed on full pastures. The farm acreage came in with its best yield in 3 years. Lenora's kitchen garden behind the ranch house produced more squash and tomatoes and green beans and peppers than any one household could reasonably consume, and she spent a considerable amount of August preserving them in jars that lined the white shelves Elijah had built for her, which were now very necessary rather than merely convenient. On an evening in late August, with the day's heat just beginning to relent and the sky turning the color of a peach above the western pastures, Elijah found Lenora sitting on the porch with her mending in her lap and her eyes not on the mending but on the horizon. In that particular way, she sometimes sat that told him she was thinking about something from before. He sat down beside her and didn't ask anything, just sat, because he'd learned that there were times when presence was the right response and words were not. After a while she said, "I think about that July morning sometimes. The morning I walked into Aldridge's bank for the last time." "What do you think about it?" he asked. She looked at the sunset. "I think about how close it was, how close I was to losing the farm. What would have happened to the children and me if Dorothy hadn't known you, or if you hadn't," she paused, "if you hadn't been the kind of man who says yes when everyone else says no." He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that too," he said. "From the other side, I think about what I would have missed, what my life would have gone on being without you in it." She looked at him then. He was looking at the same sunset she'd been looking at, the big Texas sky going gold and rose above the pastures, and the evening light was on his face, and his hair had some gray in it now that hadn't been there in 1878, and she thought he was the most solid thing she had ever known. "It was a long road," she said, "from that morning to here. Worth every mile," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the same gesture he'd made to her that October evening on her farmhouse porch 5 years ago, hand over hand in the lamplight. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, and they sat like that, watching the Texas sunset do its extravagant work, while behind them in the house they could hear Alma explaining something to James with the authoritative confidence of a 12-year-old who has decided her role in life is to explain things, and the sound of Cody's voice reading aloud from his correspondence, practicing the formal language he was teaching himself in preparation for the law studies he'd decided, quietly and with conviction, that he did want to pursue. James, who was 3 years old and had the particular energy of a 3-year-old in a household that loved him lavishly, appeared in the doorway at that point and announced that he had found a frog which he was holding up for inspection. It was a large frog with the disgruntled expression of an animal that had expected its evening to go differently. "Where did you find that?" Elijah said. "By the pump," James said. "He lives there, I think." "He probably does," Elijah said. "You should put him back." "Can I keep him?" James said. "James," Lenora said, "you cannot keep everything you find by the pump." "I only find frogs," James said, with the reasonable tone of someone presenting evidence. "Last week it was a lizard," Lenora said. "He left by himself," James said. Elijah made a sound that was very close to a laugh, and Lenora said firmly but without real severity that the frog needed to go back to the pump where it had its own life to live. And James went back inside looking resigned, and then reappeared without the frog and climbed into his father's lap and fell asleep there within 10 minutes, as small children do, with the suddenness and completeness of a candle being snuffed. Elijah sat with his son's warm weight against him, and his wife's hand in his, and the last of the sunset gold fading over the pastures, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had room enough in it for all the things worth having. 2 more years passed. Cody turned 15 and then 16, growing into a young man who had Thomas Chandler's steadiness and something of Elijah's thoughtfulness and his mother's precision with words, a combination that made his Uncle William's prediction about the law seem increasingly prescient. He wrote long letters to William now, serious letters full of questions about legal principles and case examples that William answered with evident delight at having a correspondent worth the effort. He helped on the ranch with the full capability of someone who had grown up working, and he had the particular quality of a person who can move between physical labor and intellectual work without needing to choose between them. Alma at 14 was everything she had always promised to be, bright and fearless and outspoken, with a gift for mathematics that had impressed her school teacher, and a social presence that filled whatever room she walked into. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's directness, and she had taken to ranch life with an enthusiasm that sometimes made Elijah's ranch hands look at each other with expressions of respectful consternation. She had opinions about cattle management that were occasionally inconvenient in their correctness. James at 5 was everything a 5-year-old could be asked to be, which was to say loud and curious and affectionate and always finding things by the pump. It was Alma who noticed, with the perceptive accuracy of a teenager who misses very little, that her mother's dresses were fitting differently again in the spring of 1885, and who came to find Lenora in the kitchen garden one morning with the expression of someone who has figured out a puzzle but wants to confirm it. "Mama," she said. Lenora looked up from the bean rows. "Yes." "Are we having another baby?" Alma said. Lenora looked at her daughter for a moment, this 14-year-old who had once scattered flower petals enthusiastically at her wedding, and who was now looking at her with eyes that were adult and knowing, and also, underneath the knowing, completely delighted. "Where is your stepfather?" Lenora said. "In the barn," Alma said. "Should I get him?" "Yes," Lenora said, "get him." Elijah came out of the barn with a smear of grease on his hand from whatever he'd been fixing, and he looked from his wife's face to his stepdaughter's face, and he said, "Again." "Again," Lenora confirmed with a smile she couldn't help. He took 3 steps across the garden, grease on his hand and all, and kissed her in the middle of the bean rows, which made Alma say something between a laugh and a groan and retreat with dignity back to the house. The baby, a girl this time, was born in November of 1885, and she came into the world in the bedroom of the Double C's main house with Dorothy Finch in attendance again, because Dorothy Finch attended most significant events in Harker County and considered it her prerogative. They named her Clara Elizabeth Collier, and she had Elijah's dark eyes and, in the verdict of the assembled family, Lenora's expression of determined opinion, which was visible from the first hour. Cody, 17 and increasingly resembling the young man he was rapidly becoming, held his new half-sister with the careful gravity he brought to important things, and looked at her face for a long time. "She looks serious," he said. "She looks like your mother," Elijah said. "That's what I meant," Cody said, which made Lenora laugh from the bed where she was propped on pillows and which made Elijah put his hand over his mouth to conceal his expression. Alma held Clara with the authority of someone who had been waiting to do this for some time, and whispered the same comprehensive introduction she'd once given to James, updated for current events. James sat beside Alma and looked at Clara with the thoughtful expression of a 5-year-old confronting something he hasn't previously encountered and deciding how to categorize it. "Is she staying?" James said. "She is staying," Elijah confirmed. "Good," James said, apparently satisfied with this, and went back to the block construction he'd been engaged in on the floor. The winter of 1885 settled over the Double C with a softness that felt earned, the way comfort feels earned when you've known what the alternative is. Lenora nursed Clara through the cold months while the ranch hunkered down for winter, and the household found its adjusted rhythm with a new small person at its center. Elijah tended to the ranch's winter operations, and to his family with the same careful steadiness that had always been his essential quality, checking in and showing up and being present in the concrete, practical way that was his primary language. There were evenings when all of them were in the main room together, Cody reading by the lamp, Alma working on the mathematics problem she'd requested from her teacher, because the school's lessons were moving too slowly for her, James building things on the floor or drawing pictures with the deliberate seriousness of a young artist, Clara asleep in her cradle near the stove, and Lenora and Elijah at the table going over the ranch accounts or just sitting with their coffee. And the room held all of that at once. The noise and the quiet and the light and the lives overlapping, and it was full in a way that Lenora sometimes had to stop and simply look at. She'd think about that July morning in 1878, the walk into the Crestfall Savings and Lending Institution in her best green dress, the polished certainty of Preston Aldridge's refusal, the 5 banks in 3 weeks, the particular humiliation of being told, over and over, that she was not sufficient on her own. She thought about standing on the limestone step with her eyes closed and the sun on her face and allowing herself 3 seconds of despair. And she thought about Dorothy Finch on the boardwalk with her direct gray eyes and her practical words. "There's a man north of town. His name is Elijah Collier." And that ride up the Callaway Road in the early morning, not knowing, not expecting, just going because there was nowhere else to go. She thought about the kitchen in this same house, 7 years ago, with the window showing the eastern pasture and the steam rising from her coffee and a man she hadn't known yet saying, "Tell me," and then listening the way so few people ever actually listen. She thought about all the ways it might have gone differently, and she felt the weight of that gratitude that has nowhere to go but inward, the kind that makes you understand how close the better life came to not happening. Elijah looked up from the account book and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He held her gaze with the attention that had always been his particular gift. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm thinking about gratitude," she said, "and improbable things." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the table in the lamplight of the room full of their children. "Dorothy Finch saved our lives," he said, "by knowing something we didn't know yet." "Dorothy Finch saved my farm," Lenora said. "You saved everything else." He shook his head slightly. "We saved it," he said. "Together, that's how it works." She looked at him. This man who had said yes when every other door was closed, who had built a well housing out of his own spare lumber because she needed it, who had listened to her as though her words had weight, who had been steady through fever and hard seasons and fence disputes, and all the ordinary difficulties that make up a life, who had loved her children as his own from the very beginning and given them more children to add to the number, who had treated her as an equal in the business of their life together, in an era that didn't particularly encourage it, who had said "I know what I know" on a cold December morning in a kitchen that was now hers as much as his. "Together," she agreed. Cody left for San Antonio in the fall of 1886, at 17, to begin his law studies under Uncle William's guidance, and the day he rode out was a day of complicated feeling, pride and missing him already, and the particular bittersweet sensation of watching your child move into the future you always intended for them. He embraced Lenora for a long moment, and he shook Elijah's hand, and then, in a gesture that surprised and moved them both, he hugged Elijah too, a brief, firm embrace that was more eloquent than anything he would have said. "Take care of them," he said quietly. "Always," Elijah said. He wrote every week. His letters were long and precise, and full of the sharp, methodical mind that Thomas had first noticed, and Elijah had always recognized. And Lenora read each one aloud at the supper table so the whole family could hear. And James would ask a question that demonstrated he'd been listening, even when he appeared to be doing something else entirely. And Alma would make a sharp observation about whatever legal principle Cody had been discussing. And Elijah would say something brief and accurate that got to the heart of it, and Clara would be asleep in her high chair by the end of it, because she was 1 year old, and legal education was not yet her primary interest. The Double C went on, season after season, in the good established rhythm of a working ranch. The cattle herd grew in the years when growth made sense and contracted in the years when it didn't, guided by Lenora's arithmetic and Elijah's instinct, and their shared willingness to disagree about it, and then reach a position they could both defend. The farm acreage produced steady income. The children grew. Alma, at 16, announced with characteristic directness that she wanted to attend the normal school in Austin and become a teacher, which she said was the obvious practical application of what she was already doing, which was knowing everything and explaining it to people. Lenora and Elijah took this announcement seriously, and they made a plan for it, because that was what they did with their children's intentions. They took them seriously and they made plans. "She'll be the best teacher in the county," Elijah said to Lenora that night. "In the state," Lenora said. James at 7 had become an expert in the natural history of the area surrounding the Double C pump, including frogs, lizards, 3 varieties of snake he'd been instructed not to handle, a family of barn swallows that had nested in the corner of the equipment shed, and the colony of horned beetles that lived under the flat rock by the South Corral. He documented these with drawings in a composition book that had been given to him for his birthday, and that Elijah had replenished 3 times because James filled them up. Clara at 2 was the particular joy of the household, an emphatic, bright-eyed presence who had learned to walk with the decisive confidence of someone who has somewhere important to be, and who said the names of things in a firm voice, as though announcing them into existence. On a warm evening in June of 1887, when the sky above the double C was the exact shade of blue that only Texas summer evenings achieve. Lenora and Elijah sat on the porch after supper in the time they always kept for themselves. The children distributed variously around the house and the yard, and the evening settled around them with its particular gift of stillness. Lenora was 39 years old. Her dark hair had threads of silver in it now that she didn't bother to disguise, because she had more interesting things to think about. The lines around her eyes were the lines of a woman who had spent years looking at a horizon and who had found, on the other side of a very bad year, a life that justified the looking. Elijah was 43. The gray at his temples had increased, and he wore it well, and he still had the same dark eyes with the same quality of attention in them that had told her, on that cold December morning when he asked her to marry him, that he was a man who meant what he said. "I want to tell you something," she said, which was what he'd said to her once on this porch or the porch of her old farmhouse in an October that seemed both yesterday and 100 years ago. He looked at her. "All right. I was thinking today about that morning I drove to your ranch," she said. "Before I knew you at all, I was thinking about what I was expecting, or not expecting, really. I didn't expect anything because I'd learned not to. I just went because Dorothy told me to go and I had nowhere else to go. I remember watching your wagon come through the gate," he said. "I thought, who drives out at this hour and sits that straight in a wagon seat?" She smiled. "I was terrified," she said. "I just don't look terrified." "No," he agreed, "you don't." "I didn't know what I was going to find," she said. "I was expecting another set of conditions, another set of reasons why the answer had to be no." She paused. "And you said yes just like that, without making it a transaction or a performance or a demonstration of power." He was quiet, listening. "I've thought about that many times," she said. "About what it meant that you said yes. Not just practically, though practically it changed everything, but what it meant about who you are, that you looked at a woman you'd never met who had nothing a bank would recognize as value and you saw value anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. "I saw a person trying to save her family," he said. "That seemed worth helping." "Not everyone would have seen it that way," she said. "No," he said, "I know." She looked out at the evening pasture where the horses were grazing in the long summer light and at the double C's good land stretching north toward the sky. "I'm grateful," she said, "every day, for that morning and for everything it led to." She looked at him. "For you." He took her hand in both of his the way he did and held it in the warm evening air. "I got the better of this bargain by a long way," he said. "You know that." "We can disagree about that," she said. "We can," he said. "It won't change my position." She laughed, and the laugh was the fullest sound she made, open and warm and entirely herself, and he looked at her with the expression he'd had on their wedding day and that she'd been seeing ever since, that expression of happiness that was bigger than his capacity to contain it. The evening held them. Inside the house, Clara was calling for her mother with the authoritative volume of a 2-year-old who considers a closed door a personal affront. James was explaining something at length to what sounded like the cat. Alma was at the table with her books. Cody's last letter sat on the desk in the sitting room, full of news from San Antonio, his latest case study, Uncle William's health, his plans for the following year. All of it was there, inside and outside, the fullness of the life they'd made from a cold December morning and a kitchen table and $65, and the particular grace of a man who had learned from his mother what it cost a person to be refused when they were trying to survive. From the wide Texas sky, the last light of the day went gold and then orange, and then a deep and luminous rose, pouring itself generously over the pastures and the corrals and the good red barn and the well housing built of spare lumber, the pump still drawing up clean water from the aquifer that Heinrich Brunner had found all those years ago, and that had never since run dry. Lenora sat on the porch of the Double C Ranch house in the summer evening and held her husband's hand and listened to her children's voices from inside and felt, with the full certainty of someone who has known both the scarcity and the abundance, that this was the thing itself. Not the absence of difficulty, not the perfection of circumstances, but the presence of the right person beside you when the sun goes down, and the sound of your children alive in the rooms behind you, and the work of good land in your hands, and the knowledge, bone deep and sure, that the morning you almost didn't get back up was the morning that led, by road and by grace and by one man's yes, to everything worth having. The stars came out over Texas, thick and white and low, the way they always do when the heat of the day releases its grip, and the sky opens itself up to showing what it contains. And Lenora Chandler Collier and Elijah Collier sat together on their porch under all that light and were, in the fullest and most ordinary and most extraordinary sense of the word, home.